When Karoline Leavitt sat down for the interview, she expected a heated debate. What she didn't anticipate was a moment so explosive that it would bring down one of the most recognizable TV hosts overnight. It happened live, not in some pre-recorded segment where producers could intervene, edit things out, or smooth over the rough edges. No, this was raw, unfiltered, and unfolding in real time. Karoline had been invited onto the Morning Current, a political talk show known for its sharp debates and even sharper hosts. Across from her sat Paul Danning, a veteran journalist with a reputation for pushing buttons. His interviews were aggressive, his style relentless. He wasn't just a moderator, he was an opponent. And today, his challenger was a rising conservative voice who wasn't going to back down. The segment began predictably enough. Paul pressed Karoline on media bias, accusing conservative outlets of peddling misinformation while claiming that networks like his were merely correcting the record. Karoline countered with facts, listing instances where mainstream media had misrepresented stories, omitted key details, or outright misled the public. It was tense but professional, for a moment, just another spirited debate. Then something changed. Paul leaned forward, his expression tightening. His tone, once measured, took on an edge. He wasn't debating anymore. He was attacking. "People like you," he said, his voice laced with frustration, "are the reason this country is backsliding. You push this fake narrative of victimhood, pretending conservatives are being silenced when in reality, you're the ones silencing everyone else." The studio went silent. Karoline blinked, her posture composed, but her eyes sharpened. She had handled aggressive interviews before, but this was different. She let the moment hang before responding. "Excuse me." Paul didn't back down. In fact, he doubled down. "You act like free speech is under attack, but what you really want is control. Your people." He stopped himself, but it was too late. The damage was done. The energy in the studio shifted. The producers, once passively observing, exchanged glances. Crew members stiffened, waiting to see what would happen next. Karoline didn't shout. She didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. She simply asked, "Would you like to clarify what you mean by your people?" The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Paul hesitated, just for a second. But that second was all it took. The cameras were still rolling. The internet was watching. Paul Danning wasn't a man who backed down easily. His entire career had been built on controlling the conversation, steering it where he wanted. But this time, he had lost the reins. The moment those two words, "your people," left his mouth, something shifted. It wasn't just a poor choice of phrasing. It was the implication behind it, the kind of phrase that could be dissected, twisted, and replayed 1,000 times over. And Karoline knew it. She sat back, folding her hands in her lap, giving him the space to either correct himself or sink deeper. Paul inhaled sharply. "I meant conservatives," he said too quickly. "People like you who push an agenda of grievance instead of progress." Karoline tilted her head. "So, just to be clear," she said, her voice measured, "when you said your people, you weren't referring to anything beyond political ideology?" Paul's lips pressed into a thin line. He had been in the game long enough to recognize a trap when he saw one. If he pushed back, he risked confirming the very thing people were already thinking. If he admitted it was a mistake, he looked weak, so he shifted the goalposts. "Oh, come on, Karoline. Don't play the victim here," he scoffed, letting out a dry chuckle. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. This bad faith outrage. You know exactly what I meant. But instead of engaging with the actual argument, you'd rather twist my words and make it about you." Karoline didn't flinch. She wasn't going to let him redirect. "I don't need to twist anything, Paul. Your words speak for themselves." A flicker of something crossed his face. Irritation, maybe even a hint of regret. But he was too deep in it now. He couldn't afford to backpedal. So he made a fatal mistake. "You know what?" he said, shaking his head. Maybe if conservatives spent less time playing the victim and more time actually contributing something to society, we wouldn't be having this conversation. There it was, a blanket statement, delivered with arrogance, live on air. The silence that followed was suffocating, not just in the studio but on the other side of the screen, where thousands, soon to be millions, were watching. Even Paul seemed to realize it the second the words left his mouth. His lips parted, as if to soften the blow, but it was too late. Karoline let the words hang before responding. "Are you saying conservatives don't contribute to society, Paul?" He exhaled, rolling his shoulders back. "I'm saying this. Constant whining about being canceled is exhausting." Karoline nodded slowly, her face unreadable, but her silence said everything. The damage had been done. Within minutes, the clip exploded across the internet. A 15-second snippet of Paul Danning's words. Maybe if conservatives spent less time playing the victim and more time actually contributing something to society, spread like wildfire. No context, no prelude, just that sentence. An hour later, the hashtags began trending. Paul, Danning, media bias exposed. Karoline was right. Sponsors got involved. By midday, 3 major advertisers for the Morning Current suspended their partnerships. By evening, 5 more followed. Inside NBS News headquarters, executives were in full-blown crisis mode. Viewers flooded the network with emails demanding action. Advertisers weren't just pausing sponsorships anymore, they were pulling out entirely. At 3 p.m., NBS released an official statement. Paul Danning has been placed on indefinite suspension while we conduct an internal review, but the Internet had zero patience for half measures. The suspension wasn't enough. People wanted termination. That evening, Karoline appeared on another show. When asked if Paul should be fired, she paused, then said, "I think people in positions of influence should be held accountable for their words." It was measured, strategic, devastating. The next morning, at 9:15 a.m., NBS News made its final decision. Effective immediately, Paul Danning is no longer affiliated with NBS News. We thank him for his years of service and wish him the best in his future endeavors. The media world erupted. Some called it justice, others called it an overreaction. But one thing was certain: Paul Danning was finished, and the conversation was only getting started.